podcasts are going to be very heated today, and we're going to have to take turns.
Are we going to have to be heated? Eric, are you excited about this podcast or what?
No, not at all.
That's a good way. That's a good place to start.
Eric wants to stay up in his ivory tower, and as soon as culture war, then he's like, nah.
I'm above this. I'm floating in the clouds above this.
Eric, just pound a few beers.
Yeah, I'm already through a bit of tequila. I'm feeling actually much more mellow than I should be, probably.
Oh, whatever.
I was going to say, you need to let the dark side flow through you. Let the anger.
Yeah. Exactly.
Listeners, what's up? We were planning to move into Marx, as was promised, because the entire reason that we tried to go through Hegel was to at least give us some grounding to, okay, someone's got a police.
Oh, sorry.
5-0.
Yeah, the fire station's right by my house. It's not the police, it's the fire. Don't worry, they're out. The fire's not
unauthorized Marxist podcast.
Yeah. They're coming to get all those postmodern neo-Marxists.
Rounding them up.
As I was saying, we were planning to move into Marx, but then we had to call this emergency pod because of an article that appeared in the culture war skirmishes this week. So we will get to Marx eventually. I'm going to have to brush up on my reading myself. But for now, we're going to descend from our lofty towers in Elysium, our ivory towers, and come get our feet wet down on Earth. I think we might get some heat on this episode that we don't usually get. So if you don't know us, we have a lot of letters behind our name, which we think provides us with the modicum of authority to wade into this shit. By the way, guys, the E filter, the explicit filter, is going to be on for today. So pop your beers and rant away.
Fuck yeah. You beat me to it, Victor.
Before we get into this event, this colossal event in the world of internet leftism, I just wanted to ask you guys a question. Do you believe in Marxists? Not do you believe in Marxism, but do you believe in Marxists?
Do I believe they exist?
Well, we had a self-avowed Marxist on the last episode.
My understanding is they're kind of like Santa Claus. You know, they don't really appear except on those very special revolutionary periods where they arrive and they disseminate theory to the masses, who then spontaneously rise up and create a society full of pornographers and transgendered people and lesbians and all kinds of other wonderful things.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm not sure.
Memes.
And yeah, no doubt about that.
Boy.
I don't know. I might have to be a contrarian on this because there definitely are a lot of Marxists who believe in themselves, at least, or like unironic Marxists in grad school, at least humanities and English programs. So this is just, you kind of notice these guys because they tend to kind of like name drop like commodity fetishism, like more often than Rudy Giuliani mentions 9/11. So you can kind of, you pick it up after a while, even if the conversation has nothing to do with like Marxism. It's like, oh yeah, the author is clearly fetishizing X and Y subjects. So yeah, I'm not sure how much like they're actually familiar with the theoretical end of things, but it does seem to have become the kind of default countercultural stance in some circles, at least in grad school. So
yeah, I mean, I was thinking about our first actually ever Pill Pod episode where we talked about the Zizek versus Peterson debate. And I remember there's a key moment in that debate where Zizek kind of pushes Peterson and says, you know, who are these Marxists you're talking about? Because,
right.
Like in the university, like there's really not that many left at all. Like there's people who are into postmodern philosophy or people who draw on Foucault or these other streams, but like actual Marxists.
Certainly not so much in political science departments. Yeah.
He's like, there's very few left. And so I think to that extent, like maybe the answer would be I mean, even somebody like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Richard Wolff. It's like that alleged Marxist economist. And he's like kind of a Marxist, but he's I think he believes in Marxist critique. In fact, if I would rephrase this, I would say there are a lot of people in academia who employ and find useful the Marxist form of critique to critique the economy. But in terms of Marxists who actually believe in the kind of old-fashioned version of Marxist revolution, I think there's like less of those. Like, because even someone like Richard Wolff, his idea is like we have to bring more democracy to the workplace. Like that's basically his form of Marxism is like, let's democratize the workplace. Like,
does thinking about Marxism a Marxist make? Because you can be a Hegelian and all you have to do is let history think through you, and there, bang, you are a Hegelian. But a Marxist, they have material responsibilities, right? You have to be seizing stuff. It's not like you put a bunch of buttons on your back and now your backpack and now you're a Marxist, or wear like black skinny jeans. Now you're a Marxist and smoke cigarettes. Every Marxist smokes cigarettes.
That's true.
I mean, the ones alleged Marxists. But if you're paying rent, are you a Marxist?
You are if you hate your landlord. That's the rule. You got to always be like complaining about the landlord.
Yeah.
And smoking cigarettes when you're not supposed to. Really important. There's no such thing as a smoke-free apartment if you're a Marxist, right?
I mean, I'm totally willing to accept that Lenin was a Marxist, but even Lenin said, I'm not a Marxist, I'm a Russian communist.
Right.
Well, I believe Marx at one point said, I'm not a Marxist. Marxism means whatever these people are invoking in my name. So, these controversies go way back to the 19th century.
Yeah, it's interesting, the struggle to identify under a certain ism, but then it's funny, even the source of that is like, well, I'm not this. So it's been a contested concept for so long now that it's like, I mean, that makes it actually a good question to ask. Like, are there actually Marxists?
I should say, though, one of the interesting things about this doctrine is just, understandably, more than any other one that I can think of that emerged from a professor's pen, this provokes the most polarizing reactions. Like, there are some political theorists and serious academics I know who will say, if you're a Marxist, this is just drivel. Why are you bothering with that any longer? It's 19th century economics at best, with a little Hegelianism splashed in. I think Foucault, ironically, considering he's also lumped with these postmodern neo-Marxists, once said that Marx was boring and, he didn't really find much of use to it. And then you contrast that with some other reactions, like Martin Hägglund. I just finished his book, This Life, and he almost gives Marx a religious significance, right? Saying Marx prophesies a new era of spiritual life that was to come once we were all free of wage labor under capitalism. And this is, a society that's yet to come, but it's what we should all be striving for if we're genuinely faithful people who have any sense of humanity and any care for freedom.
Well, we are not done the intro yet. So I think I need a sound effect that I can just drop in after every name drop, specifically for Matt. So Hageland. What's up, listener?
Can't we just use like the Internationale or something like that?
You are listening to the Pill Pod. Today is Eric, Matthew, Victor, and
Victor
a
also.
second Victor.
Yeah.
Litvik, who we are also calling USSR baby. So he's very familiar with Marxism. True to form Marxism.
Who you may remember from the US episode too. So East meets West here.
Eastern Bloc Victor.
And the Pill Pod, if you don't know, is the podcast where we only use the word comrade unironically in bed. So how you doing, comrades?
Good, brother.
We've been doing some heavy shit for the last few weeks. Many have said that our episode last week was the best one ever. Many are saying it. It's around.
Wow.
Well, Matt H said it. And he's our most dedicated listener and the one who single-handedly saved this podcast when we were all about to quit. So if you want to listen to the best episode ever, you have to sign up for the Patreon.
Yeah. Oh, right. That was a Patreon-only episode, right?
And if you are a patron, I will ironically call you comrade. So everyone has a price. It's called capitalism.
That was an epic,
Checkmate.
though. I have to say, like, it was just, I actually felt like I had read through the Phenomenology of Spirit again after you had done that thing, because I was just like, man, we covered a fucking lot of topics.
Yeah, that was fun.
It was,
So if you want it, it's called Pill Pod 12.
Become a patron today.
Yeah.
It's on, what was it called again? Something, just
Recognition?
dialectic of recognition.
Yeah,
right.
recognition.
Okay.
I gotta give mad props to Borna also,
Oh, yeah, Borner was great, yeah.
Yeah, no, he fucking took like the most difficult theorist I can possibly think of and really managed to make it seem relatively accessible, and not just like accessible, but like vital. You know what I mean?
He was so much nicer in over video chat than I imagined him to be, because on the chat he was like, he seemed like defensive of the proper interpretation of Hegel, but then when he was actually there, he was like so nice and like charitable and amicable. Great dude.
Yeah, I still feel kind of inhibited, not because of Borna, just because Hegel is such a thing. getting Hegel wrong, getting Marx wrong. Like, nobody cares if you get like Freud or Darwin wrong, but if you get Marx and Hegel wrong, it's like,
no. I mean, if you get Freud wrong, sin. It's just because you're repressing your own sexuality, Eric. That's the problem.
Yeah, there's a talking cure for that.
Yeah.
But with Marx, it's like you've betrayed the revolution.
Well, I mean, if you get Freud wrong, it's because you don't realize that you just want to bang your psychoanalyst, and you got to get past that.
So, without further ado,
wow. The Sopranos just came out.
Let's talk about getting Marx wrong. Because Matt, thanks a fucking lot. You made us read the worst thing I have ever read for this week. Link in the description. Do not click on it. I warned you, and I know you're fucking going to do it anyway. This is not an endorsement either of the article or the website because both are dog shit. Anyway, Matt, what did you make us read this week?
Yeah, tell us about it.
So it was an article in the kind of center-right publication Colette, which, full disclosure, I published with quite a bit back in the day by...
But that was before it turned into more of a. It's become so much more of a right wing echo chamber than it used to be. I feel like.
Well, the reason that I did it was actually because I wanted to reach out to conservatives and convince them that the left wasn't scary, and also wasn't afraid of actually arguing with their ideas. But that's neither here nor there. The piece was by Yoram Hazoni, who's the author of The Virtue of Nationalism, which won Conservative Book of the Year back in 2019, and it's on the dangers posed by Marxism and why it is that liberals need to unite with conservatives in order to banish the specter of Marxism from the universities, from culture, from the media, and everywhere else where it's managed to get its tentacles embedded.
Yeah.
And if that makes it sound more exciting, it's not. Take it from us. 5 of us read it. You can skip it.
Yeah, but although we'll talk about it here. We'll talk about some of the arguments.
So you don't have
how
to
would you
look at it.
So that you don't have to, exactly.
I want to say, just in defense of the article, I actually thought it was really interesting, not as a piece of intellectual history or commentary, because I don't think that it's really very good on those fronts, but as a kind of artifact that synthesized a lot of right-wing stereotypes and concerns about Marx together into a singular whole. It's really kind of fascinating because I don't know any other conservative commentator who's done this at such length and so publicly as Hazoni. Even somebody like Jordan Peterson, who rants on and on about postmodern neo-Marxism, or Ben Shapiro or whatever, has never kind of made a statement about this at such length.
You're totally right. In some sense, it's true. Like the feeling I got when I was reading it was that like I was exactly reading something that all of these figures you just named, like Peterson, Shapiro, like Rubin, right? If they read it, they would be like, yes, this is what I've been trying to say all this time, but now it's been said perfectly in a way.
And if you want an endorsement, it's also been endorsed by Ted Cruz, who retweeted it.
Ted Cruz tweeted about it. Yeah.
Noted werewolf Ted Cruz came out of his cave to give his endorsement.
Noted Zodiac killer.
Noted Canadian
let's not
Ted
forget.
Cruz.
Oh, did we export him too? Why are we just exporting the
he was born in Calgary.
biggest asshole?
And is the Zodiac killer, apparently.
We're not sending the U.S. our best, unfortunately. Unlike Mexico.
Guys, I do got to shout out because I was checking our stats. Wow. We have a lot of listeners in Texas. So, comrades, I say this unironically, we feel your pain living under the Zodiac killer werewolf, Ted Cruz.
Long live Beto and the revolution. Yeah, Beto.
But seriously though, this article was, it just felt like a more sophisticated, like the Jordan Peterson view of just that Marxism is anything that involves oppressor and oppressed is like Marxism, in addition to a few other things. But that's really what it felt like, which by the way, if that's like a crucial feature of Marxism, then Aristotle is a Marxist because in the Politics he says that class, we have to correct for class antagonisms because if you have too many rich and poor people, then the whole society is going to fall apart. So like by that logic, it just seems like even Aristotle would be a Marxist, at least in part.
Well known. He's a well-known Marxist, that Aristotle.
Yeah, or even the American revolutionaries, right?
Yeah, Aristotle was a great reader of Marx.
Well,
you can't disprove it. If it's in Colette, then it's true.
It's the same way that the Beatles were great interpreters of Oasis, right? But no, I just figured we should summarize it briefly. So According in Hazoni's article, he claims that there are 4 fundamental features to the Marxist political framework. The first one is that Marx argues that all societies are divided into oppressor and oppressed classes, and that the state tends to enforce the interests of the oppressor classes. Secondly, that there's a kind of false consciousness that's disseminated across the body of the population as an official ideology. This means that both oppressor and oppressed aren't always aware of the dynamic that they're actually involved in. They may even think that it's justifiable. Thirdly, that there needs to be a revolutionary reconstitution of society that ends with the destruction of the oppressor class and its replacement with a regime that's considerably more equal. And this will, of course, be a violent revolution. And then finally, fourthly, that Marxism is characterized by the desire to end class antagonisms through establishing a utopian state. And Hazoni argues that how this is to be done is never specified. So those are the 4 features that he associates with Marxism.
Right.
And what's different about Peterson, because I have actually, you said this is better than Peterson's reading of Marx.
It's more sophisticated. I didn't say it's better.
And I thought it was more, Peterson is more insipid because he doesn't actually use the words. This guy made an effort to use the words like false consciousness, historical materialism, and class struggle, except he managed to twist these words so they're so unrecognizable from what Marx was actually talking about. So I want to ask you guys, how do we approach this? Do we want to debunk any of these claims, even with our paltry knowledge of Marx? Or do we want to talk about why he wrote this article?
I think we could probably do a little bit of both, but I would lean a little bit more towards the latter just because...
Doing a deep...
Frankly, I'm sure all we're going to do...
Yeah, doing a debunk is not always like the most necessarily interesting thing.
Yeah,
but I mean,
you don't have to go point by point. You can just kind of like attack the premise of what he's even arguing here because he's coming at this from a very specific kind of like Cold War mindset. And that's sort of like the main problem.
Well, kind of. Yeah. Can I? Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think is...
I'll give you the premise, just the first, the opening bit. We thought that 1989 ended Marxism. Quote, a mere 30 years later, Marxism is back and making an astonishingly successful bid to seize control of the most important American media companies, universities, schools, corporations, philanthropic organizations, courts, government bureaucracy, and churches.
Man, that'd be pretty interesting in Marxist church.
So Red Scare, basically.
Yeah. That's the whole ground of the argument, is that there's some kind of Marxist takeover going on. Like that's what everything lives or dies on. Is that fucking true? Is there a Marxist takeover? I mean, forget about the increasing wealth gap, forget about the centralization of control of the media, forget about corporate ownership. There's a Marxist takeover going on beneath all of that other crap, and that's what we have to be.
Or forget that like Donald Trump is president.
And his evidence.
Like this is the fucking empirical point that everything in this article rests on. And like, is it fucking true? Is it true? I don't know. If it is, if it's going on, I don't know about it.
Well, this is why I asked the question at the beginning, do we believe in Marxists? So we're going to go to Matt first and then to Victor.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Well, I have an article coming out explaining why it is that I don't like this or don't agree with it at great length. So I'll just be really brief here.
And where are you publishing it?
It's going to be in Jacobin. I don't know when it'll come out. Probably pretty soon.
But that's a Marxist publication, so we can't believe anything they say.
No, I think you mean the mainstream media dominant Jacobin magazine, widely read by millions.
It is. I mean, I'm getting paid almost $1 million just for this piece, right? Because we have so many corporate donors who are willing to donate to us. Don't tell anyone that, but my house is going to be financed on the basis of this article. But no, basically in sum, I think the biggest problem with this piece is if you read it, he treats Marxism primarily as a political doctrine about oppressor and oppressed classes. And nowhere in this entire piece does the concept of political economy arise, which is shocking when you think that Marx's 2 most famous books are both entitled A Critique of Political Economy, or a contribution to the critique of political economy. And this is really telling, right? Because for Hazoni, the only thing that's significant about Marxism is this notion that there's an oppressor and that there's an oppressed class, and he's kind of tired of leftists rallying behind the oppressed classes to try to change the status quo. He doesn't mind invoking this oppressor-oppressed narrative when it comes to conservative groups that he feels are being oppressed by nasty liberals and progressives, but generally people shouldn't be doing that. And when you do that, you lose a lot that's distinctive about Marxism and just treat it like some kind of pastiche of itself. Because Marxism without a critique of political economy really isn't much of a doctrine at all. There's nothing distinct or interesting about it.
It's a rum and Coke without the rum.
Yeah. Exactly, right? I wouldn't even call it Coke. It's more like that PC brand or no-name brand Coca-Cola.
RC Cola.
Yeah. And I think what makes this interesting, though, is that this is a very typical gesture on the part of a lot of political conservatives who endeavor to try to dissociate Marxism from its embeddedness in Hegelian philosophy, in the critique of capitalist political economy, because all that stuff's fairly sophisticated and would involve some real arguments to actually undermine. And they try to treat it like it's just some kind of rhetorical political doctrine about oppressor-oppressed class that can be easily dismissed as basically whining on the part of certain groups of people. And once it's dismissed, you don't have to really deal with it any longer. Which, of course, is not the case since we're living in a late capitalist postmodern society. And if anything, a lot of what Marx has to say is more descriptively telling, I think, than it ever has been before. And I think this is what they're ultimately worried about, even if they don't express that explicitly in a lot of pieces like that. So that's just my take on this.
Yeah, no, I think...
Thank you for keeping it short. I assume that's short for Matt McManus.
Oh, it is. But believe me, I could rant about this forever.
So I think it's very telling also that like at the beginning of part 2, he basically this is his evidence for saying that things are Marxist, or at least part of it. He says, when people, who he's referring to as Marxists, he's like, they'll disorient their opponents by referring to their beliefs with a shifting vocabulary of terms, including the left, progressivism, social justice, anti-racism, anti-fascism, Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, identity politics, political correctness, wokeness, and more. So he's basically admitting, he's literally telling you right there in that sense, I am conflating Marxism with basically everything that I don't like.
But he's
so frustrating.
He's saying you are confusing me by turning your Marxism into all these terms when he is the one turning Marxism into all these terms.
Exactly.
Demonstrably.
I mean, the idea that these groups might actually believe different things and have different agendas is just really foreign to this piece's imagination, right? It's like, really? Like, Black Lives Matter, as a Marxist movement. Was Martin Luther King a Marxist? Was Abraham Lincoln a Marxist when he decided to end slavery? What the hell is going on here?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that he's just so focused on this oppressor and oppressed relationship, which was also, I think, what Jordan Peterson was obsessed with. And like you said, like ignoring the political economy is so crucial. And I kind of think it's telling. I almost, when I read this and also listened, there's also a Colette podcast where they interview the author. And when I listened to it, I got this like strange feeling, like almost conspiratorial, that there's like a strategy behind this almost. And like, here's kind of my like half-baked conspiracy theory is like, it almost seems like these argumentative moves, by conflating all these different things with Marxism, it's like he's giving his fellow conservatives or other readers who lean conservative the authority by writing this very sophisticated piece to be like, oh, like that's what Marxism is. I knew it all along. I don't have to think about Marxism. I don't have to take Marxist critique seriously anymore. This guy's told me what Marxism is, and I know that it's all those things that are bad. And the other move that he makes, which I think is really interesting, is he basically talks about how liberalism sets the stage for this, right? He says liberalism, by degrading like traditional values, opens the door to being able to complain about all these little grievances that people feel they're being misrecognized in society or oppressed in society. So he's almost like doing a double takedown where he can be like, okay, like liberalism, it's their fault for opening the door to complaints about about feelings of oppressed from oppression from different classes. And so now we can it's like an attempted takedown of like liberalism and what he's calling Marxism. But then all the while, he's not even actually telling us anything about what Marxism really is. So
I'll interject on that point just to say, yes, there's an oppressor and an oppressed in Marx. It's the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But he generalizes this to say that there's always classes and they're always trying to exploit each other, which no, the only exploitation that occurs here is not due to fairness. It's not about being unfair. It's one class owns the surplus labor of another class. That's it. It's not about, it's a measurable effect, and you can measure that. And he says, like, this is a quote, Marx argues that as an empirical matter, people invariably form themselves into cohesive groups. He calls them classes, which exploit one another to the extent that they're able. And this is not what Marx is saying. He's not saying that we have like 20 groups everywhere. He's saying we have a group of owners, and those owners own the labor of the people who don't own their own labor. And that's it. They don't form themselves into these groups based on identities. It's just who owns what. All you have to do is open your eyes, see who owns what, and then you have classes.
I want to interject also here because I think Hazoni said something that was really smart. And then I'm actually going to pass it on to Litvik, as was called, because I think that he can maybe clarify some of the things that I'm thinking about here. Because I think what Hazoni said was really accurate, right? That the problem with these kind of pieces is it's really easy for us to sit here and pick on it from our standpoint, as academics, and being like, he doesn't understand Marxism, he doesn't know what it's about. But people don't really accept, people in our position don't always understand that these pieces have a really powerful rhetorical effect, particularly amongst conservative and liberal audiences, because Hazoni is a respected intellectual, right? He wrote a prestigious book that won a major prize. He went to Princeton. And when he says this is what Marxism is and this is why you should dismiss it, there's a huge number of people who will say, well, if a smart guy with all these kind of credentials is claiming this is what Marxism is and we can dismiss it, then that's just what we ought to do. Right. And exactly. This is why you can't just sit there and say, wow, this is dumb, let's ignore it. It needs to be kind of engaged with. Right.
Exactly.
And I figure Litvik probably knows why it is that these rhetorical strategies work. And so
you're absolutely right, Mac. As to that point, there is this whole like sort of industry out there, which is kind of like using the specter of Marxism to kind of publish articles and kind of like feed this whole like audience. But this really kind of seems to go back to the Cold War mentality that the author clearly is kind of coming from, because I don't know if you guys remember like those commercials in the 80s, or if you've heard of them, like there's a bear in the woods. Some people say the bear is safe. Who knows for sure? It's like vote Reagan, and the bear is the Soviet Union, basically. It's this ultimate appeal to emotions. It has nothing to do with the actual ideology of Marxism or anything like that. But it's much more about this Manichaean struggle between the US and the evil empire. And so back then, obviously, the evil empire was the Soviet Union, clear Marxists, identified as communists. But once that collapsed, a lot of these analysts and kind of like think tanks in DC and everything didn't really have this adversary, right? So for a while, it was kind of maybe, the war on terror, radical Islam was sort of the new bear in the woods, but it
Islamofascism is something
exactly. And they tried to like call it fascism or even Marxism, but that didn't really work because it was so structurally different. But now I guess what's exciting people like the author here is that you do have sort of like quote unquote self-identified Marxists again in the West. And so the bear is back, the boogeyman is back, right? And this opens like the sort of industry up again for talking about Marxism and communism in that way. Yeah.
And this is what I find fascinating about this article, because it really is a kind of systematic outline of that kind of affective worldview, right? That these Marxists are everywhere. They're taking over the media. They're taking over culture. They're taking over academia, right? When we need to stop them because they're omnipresent, right?
You should add this to your syllabus about conservative political thought. It's like such an interesting piece for that reason to actually read in that context.
Yeah, like as a typological piece, it's really quite fascinating, at least to me. But I kind of have a perverse interest in these things.
Yeah.
You said a word, Litvik, that I wrote down as well, Manichaean. And this is trying to get a little bit away from what he's actually saying, because I'm having a really hard time even considering that he believes what he's saying. But this Manichaeanism, that you can conjure up this sort of world picture that's so simplistic. And I would be shocked, even teaching like second-year undergraduates, I would be shocked to get a paper like this, because it's so conspiratorial in a cosmological sense, that there's this Lovecraft Cthulhu devil like living in the sewers, creeping up to actually destroy civilization. And this is theory for like the 20-year-olds, of course, the 20-year-olds who just finished 12 Rules for Life and they want like some more politics to engage in. But I cannot think that he can believe this. And if he can, and all the comments, by the way, on this article are like, this is the most important thing I've ever read. I can't believe it's taken someone so long to say this. And I think I might just be an academic elitist or disconnected with this line of thinking, because I cannot fit this in my head as anything beyond a rhetorical strategy. Because if some people can believe this, then I'm at a loss for words.
It's definitely like a remnant of the sort of geopolitical binary, though, from the 80s, where this guy clearly kind of like grew up, because you did kind of have the sort of struggle between East and West then, Reagan and Gorbachev and everything. But now he's sort of applying it in a very sloppy way to university campuses and sort of the Western context in North America, where clearly that kind of Manichaeism is laughable. Yeah, as you're saying.
Well, so what I was saying before too about like this being a potential strategy, like I agree, Pills, that, you know, it's hard to believe that this is serious in a sense, which is what like makes me think that there's a strategy, like some kind of a strategy behind this, because I think like often when academics get a bit nitpicky about using the correct words, right? And like, I think we do have that tendency. And I could imagine someone being like, okay, well, whatever, is it Marxist or is it not Marxist? Like, that's beside the point. Like, are the things he's describing actually happening, right? Like someone might ask that. And, you know, to some extent you could say, yeah, sure. Like some of these things that you're describing about like wokeness or whatever, they're happening. But like to call them Marxist, like this is where I think the strategy part comes in, right? Because by saying that these things are Marxist, then you're authorizing the dismissal of actual Marxism, which, you know, doing a class analysis, doing an economic analysis of society, of like how money is spread through our society, income inequality. Like if you're a conservative, like that's like a scary thing to do. So it makes sense to be like, oh no, like this is Marxism. Don't look at Marxism, you know, and I'm not a Marxist. Like this is coming from someone who is not a Marxist, but I value Marxist and economic analysis. And I can see that there's something insidious about, you know, like labeling something that isn't Marxist Marxism, and then that authorizes people to just be like, I'm never going to look at Marxism. Actually, Marxism.
There has to be dark money behind this, though, or something. Because
it seems like
Bernie is a third of the way to Marxism, and he got fucking owned. He got eviscerated by all of these institutions that are supposedly Marxist.
Exactly. I also think there's another important insidious aspect to this piece, which unless someone wants to pick up on something exactly that Matt said, but I kind of want to like also flag again which I think is almost the scarier part of this piece, which is the critique of liberalism itself, the attack on liberalism as a principle, because one of the moves he makes, which I think like from a rhetorical perspective is kind of interesting and smart, is like he says, look, liberalism has the basic claim that all people are free and equal. Right. And like, so like liberalism is the way that affirms everybody's equal dignity, right? Everyone has equal freedom. But then based from that foundation, then you can start making claims and pointing to classes and groups of people who aren't actually free and equal. And then that creates this cycle where then the Marxist will come in and be like, well, look, no one's free and equal based on liberalism. So we have to bring Marxist revolution. And then that creates this, what he calls like this Marxist liberal cycle. I forget the exact term he uses. And like, I think what's kind of insidious about that is this is a covert argument for traditional like conservative values, because what he's saying is like liberalism is based on this, like he doesn't actually say that, but like I feel like there's a subtext that like you know, people aren't free and equal. Like maybe that's an idea that we need to like let go of and return to some sort of traditional society that values certain things hierarchically. I don't know if you guys agree. Maybe that's too much reading into it, but like that's sort of the sense I got from reading this sort of attack on the idea of equality as being responsible for.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it reminded me of a joke in The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon, where the main character encounters a bunch of hyper-conservatives who turn out to be really anti-capitalist. And she asks them, like, well, why is it you're anti-capitalist exactly? And they're like, you just don't understand. We're anti-capitalist because capitalism creates Marxists. And, you know, we can't have that, right? And this article seemed of a type with that kind of joke, because the author has a really tangentious relationship with liberalism, because on the one hand, he doesn't like its commitment to moral equality and to freedom. And he sees those as genealogically prior to the emergence of Marxism as a doctrine that also respects freedom and equality, but radicalizes that by saying even liberal society isn't enough. On the one hand, I think the reason why he's making the kind of gesture at the end of the article towards liberals is because he knows that tactically, the people in the liberal center are either going to align with the political left, people like Bernie Sanders, people like AOC, and so on, or they're going to align with the political right. And the political right can't win if liberals decide to side with the political left, so he needs to try to entice them in, even though he himself is not particularly predisposed to liking liberalism all that much, since it's basically just a better or less radical variant of what Marxism, as he understands it, stands for. You know what I mean?
And to that point, yeah, he's also like exploiting divisions probably within like the current Democratic Party, where there clearly are two different wings. And he's basically telling like the old school Democrats, look, if you're not with like the AOC Bernie Sanders wing, then you have to be a Republican conservative, because otherwise, look at the doomsday scenario that I'm laying out. So yeah, to your point, Victor,
yeah, I think that's right.
I think, yeah, that is something conscious and kind of cynical that he's doing, where he's deliberately sort of exploiting that division even in sort of the left-wing spectrum of American politics. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's not subtle about it. I mean, he basically says, like, they're going to erode democracy and destroy it at the end, right?
And as I understand it, he came out on a podcast to explain this. I didn't listen to this, but Eric, you listened to the podcast. So what additional insights did you glean from listening to that?
Yeah, I mean, the way he actually kind of started the podcast like backwards, like he almost started at like the end of his essay and then kind of went backwards. And he was like, the whole point of me like writing that piece was to give people like a framework for understanding the events of summer 2020. And I thought that was just, that just revealed the whole game right there. Because, like, let's explain what's going on in 2020 without a single reference to COVID, without a single reference to police brutality or police murdering Black folks. Let's explain 2020 as an eruption of crypto-Marxism in the leftist parties. And that to me was just one of the most disgusting parts about this piece. Like, this guy's a fucking douchebag. He's trying to teach us about why everything's so fucked up right now, but it's not because of a pandemic. It's not because of the history of slavery and prejudice
or economic inequality
in the United States. It's not because of American imperialism and the McDonaldization of the fucking world. It's because of this crypto-Marxism that's resurging after it fell in 1989, and now it's coming back. And he tells this ridiculous fucking story about how the liberals in the 60s were doing good stuff, but it wasn't the student liberals, it was their parents. They were passing the civil rights laws. Like, that was a big victory. Like, let's just forget that the civil rights movement was going on for decades and decades and was frustrated in many of its aims and was much more radical than any of us understand today. Let's forget all that and say that was a liberal victory. And then we skip to 1989. That's point number 2. And then we skip to today. And that's his fucking story. That's his like reverse hagiography of Marxism. And
man, Eric is not happy.
No, the listeners cannot see him, but Eric is leaning back, running his hands through his hair frustratedly.
With pure exasperation.
Yeah. I don't even know what to do about this. Like, I'm not a political theorist or anything, but like, even like, look at near the end of his article, he writes about legitimacy. I mean by legitimacy when one party recognizes its rivals as having a right to rule if it wins an election. Isn't legitimacy in a democracy come from the people who elect the fucking party and not from one party saying, you're cool, I hate you, but you can rule if I lose?
Yes.
Like, that's not legitimacy. What fucking class at Yale was he taking? Or wherever the fuck he went to school?
I think it's quite telling, though, that when he talks about political legitimacy, the only two groups he mentions are liberals and conservatives, who are apparently the only people who respect democracy in this world, despite the Viktor Orbáns, the Vladimir Putins, or Trump saying that he's going to cancel or pause the election, right? He never acknowledges that the left can in any way be respective of democracy.
And this is, again, he also commits the classic ridiculous meme that conservatives have, you know, where they bring up Stalinism as like some argument to show like how much it failed, right? Like, this is always the classic kind of move that the meme conservatives like to latch onto. And like, I think what's forgotten in Marxism because of like the experience with Stalinism is that like, Marx and like socialism is actually quite concerned with democracy, right? Like this is, I mean, of course, a failure of Stalinism was not enough democracy, but I think like, actual Marxism or actual socialism would be deeply democratic. But his claim at the end of the article, right, is that the Marxist endgame is an end to democracy or something like that, which is totally, the opposite point of what the main concern of Marxism, which, as Eric was saying, right, like legitimacy comes from the people, right? Like the whole point of, I think, like a Marxist analysis is to, in some ways, like re-legitimize like the sources of authority over how we build a life together as people, as citizens.
Although, to be fair, you do have to get rid of the bourgeoisie first. But the whole the whole point of the annihilation of the bourgeoisie is that there's no classes anymore, because there's only two classes and they're getting their identity from each other. So if you eliminate one, the other's gone, except that there's more proletarians than there are bourgeoisie. So it should be just a numbers game who wins there. But anyway,
sure, and that's kind of where I maybe stop being a bit of a Marxist myself. But yeah, that's beside the point.
Yeah, no, I don't think any of us are orthodox Marxist here. I don't know, Victor. Have you had any last minute conversions since I spoke to you a few weeks ago?
Well, sound off.
No, most certainly not, being a child of Eastern Europe and all that. No, but what's interesting too is kind of like how the cynical thing in this article really is to kind of align the protest movements from summer 2020, like to your point, Eric, with Marxism, and to kind of like do this thing that was done even in like Latin American countries as well, when you had like a lot of liberation movements which were loosely affiliated with Marxism, or like the Catholic Church in that sense. And they were all kind of like demonized by right-wing governments there as like being communist, kind of like being third column movements. So there is this sort of cynical move there where he's sort of sidestepping the real issues of like racial inequality and all these things, and kind of just promoting this conspiratorial view of like, the creeping influence of Marxism and things like that, which I don't know like how much of a true believer he is, but like this is like an old kind of like rhetorical move where any kind of like demands for social justice are sort of like lumped in with Stalinism and things like that. So, well, it's a very comforting fantasy for the conservative mind. Exactly. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. It's striking also because if you look at a lot of the Black Lives Matters protesters and advocates, take the most intellectually sophisticated one, Cornel West, who I think is a great academic, right? I've never once seen him appeal to Karl Marx as a justification for the protests against the George Floyd murder, right? He's talked a lot about MLK, right? He's talked a lot about, ironically enough, considering Hazoni's own religious affiliation, our duties as good Christians and the fact that we're trying to realize, the basic foundational values of our society. But there's really not a lot of Marx to be found about this. And it's quite telling, like Victor was saying, that they're trying to really lump what really is a movement against centuries of racial oppression into this old-fashioned paradigm of USA versus Marxism or the West versus Marxism in order to just try to dismiss it when they're raising very legitimate concerns that are certainly tied to the critique of political economy, but aren't reducible to the critique of political economy.
And what's funny too is that like even like a lot of BLM activists wouldn't necessarily identify as being Marxist. Like their focus is on specifically the race sort of framework, not the economic framework so much. But he completely sort of like overlooks that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really frustrating, right? And like a lot of people have said, I find it really distasteful that he doesn't acknowledge the fact that these people have legitimate reasons to be protesting on these issues. And some of them very well might not be Marxist, but nonetheless, they have legitimate grievances against the status quo that should be acknowledged, particularly a long history of racial injustice. And all that's kind of sidestepped by this reductionism.
Matt, I have like a quick question for you, because you've talked a lot more to kind of like authors like this and people who sort of promote this sort of worldview. Do you think ultimately they are just trying to kind of like advance a certain kind of industry and have like a sort of a 9-to-5 job about this stuff? Or are they really true believers in the sense of like the threat of Marxism and these kinds of issues?
I was going to ask a similar question. Like this just feels like a ploy for relevance. And it may be the ineptitude of my imagination, but I cannot fit this world picture into my head.
No, this is a fucking game. It's an opportunistic takedown piece with no substance.
No, but I think it does have some substance, actually, to a lot of people who read it, right? And this is part of the problem, right, of treating it in terms of the intrinsic value of this piece as an intellectual artifact, right? And in answer to your question, Victor, right, I think that a lot of these authors, on the one hand, definitely do believe that what they're saying has a certain amount of truth. But at the same time, they're not really concerned about whether or not it's a literal truth, right? It's more of a visceral or gut feeling about what's going on. And this is something that's really important when it comes to progressives trying to understand how it is that conservatives apprehend the world. Russell Kirk, the author of The Conservative Mind, put it really well, where he said, conservatism isn't so much a set of principles as it's an outlook or an attitude that you take toward things, right? It's a very visceral reaction towards the world. And conservatives tend to apprehend things through the lens of affect, more than their rationalist counterparts do amongst liberal political theory and Marxist political theory or leftist political theory more broadly.
Which is so ironic, by the way, because I feel like all the conservative memes these days online, it's like about like logic and reason, like all the commentators, right? But like so many of their arguments are based on like some feeling they have about like society falling apart based on like very slim evidence or selective evidence. Anyway, sorry to cut you off.
No, but you're absolutely right. But the thing is, what conservatives are doing in those kind of cases are what they've always been doing, going back to the 18th century, which is recognizing that the parlance of liberalism and of scientific rationality is extremely powerful in the 21st century. So there's no way of jettisoning it and just appealing directly to affect. You have to kind of appeal to affect through the lens of scientific rationalism, right? Which is, a different kind of subject matter that we can talk about elsewhere, right? But when it comes to this article, right, I think that a lot of people are going to sit there and just treat this as intellectually substanceless and therefore not worthy of engagement. But it is worthy of engagement because what this really does quite effectively is it ties together a lot of things that conservatives have believed for a very long time, gives them a kind of systematic gloss, and presents them with an authority and intellectual backing that a lot of people have wanted for quite some time. And through vindicating this sense of the world coming apart because cultural Marxists are attacking it, I'm not surprised that it's gotten the kind of rapturous response that it has, right? Because it essentially vindicates what a lot of people have felt viscerally for a long time on the political right.
To try to move this forward, I would like to ask you guys what you want to do with this, because it would be absolutely pointless to break this article down line by line and show how it's not Marxism. Because I think anyone who's even read Communist Manifesto one time can look through this and show that it's completely erroneous. Like, for example, he says races are the new classes or something like that. Marxists pit blacks against whites as the new class warfare. So anyway, like just leaving all that aside, there's two ways forward I think we could talk about. We could talk about actual antagonisms between liberalism and Marxism to actually educate our listeners on what that actually is. Or we could talk about the general psychological impulse that requires this person to create such an entity, a Lovecraftian entity that all of his like followers and retweeters have to rally behind. So which of those two, are either of those two avenues interesting to you, or do you want to keep railing on this article?
I think both of them are kind of interesting. And actually, I'd like to talk about the Lovecraftian stuff. Because just for interested listeners, one of the themes that we were thinking of exploring before this article came out was political enemies, right? Why it is that people set up X, Y, or Z group as their antagonist and what the ideological and effective appeal of that is. And I think if we were to address things from this Lovecraftian tentacle perspective, that would be kind of interesting. But I'm open to whatever.
Plugging our Patreon once again, that's what we were talking about last week, is how what dialectics means is that you create your enemy just by means of moving through the world and absorbing objects.
This is a specter.
Yeah. I think we've already kind of touched on that too, like by mentioning, for example, like those old commercials from like the 80s where like Reagan's re-election campaign was just like an image of a bear lurking in the woods, and everybody knew what the bear represented. But it didn't have to be like beyond the level of affect, basically. It was this clear sense of like the enemy or the scapegoat in that sense. Yeah. And that's the sort of comforting narrative that like the author is clearly trying to kind of like go back to in this sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and just in response to like Victor's kind of comment, I think that kind of imagery wouldn't necessarily be effective in today's 21st century climate, where people tend to be a lot more cynical and a lot more reticent to overtly propagandistic efforts, right? Which is why you see a lot of these authors appeal to reason and logic, and facts don't care about your feelings, because that kind of gestures to the authority of scientific rationalism and kind of liberal open-mindedness, even if the figures who actually tend to invoke this most frequently don't actually embody those norms in their approach, particularly to doctrines that they don't particularly like.
Yeah, and what's fascinating too, though, like even in the sense of sort of solidifying the in-group against the out-group in that sense, is that the out-group is portraying as not having logic, right? So it still is sort of like this binary opposition, but it is much more sort of like looking to this question of logic, as sort of being on our side versus their side.
Whereas, like, the simplest part of the Marxist logic, like, to me, I'm not a Marxist, right? But it's so simple. It's, where is the surplus of your wages going? Who's benefiting from it? And then how many are you versus how many are they? Like, this is just the simplest, most logical, empirical, open your eyes and count sort of logic. And then, the Marxists are painted as the hysterical ones. When the other ones, the conservatives are worried about Cthulhu.
But Pills, that's the thing. Like, you can't really divorce that from the sort of like the 50-year-old Cold War history here. That's the thing that, we wish we could kind of just look at it theoretically, but there is that historical baggage, which for a lot of people is how they primarily sort of understand the Marxist brand. Yeah.
So Eric suggested that in the podcast, he sort of gave the game away a little bit. So to those of you who listened to the podcast, did you get any indication from his affection that this was a rhetorical strategy, or is this like sincere dyed-in-the-wool belief, ideology?
Well, it's kind of, I mean, one thing I noticed when I listened to it, which was kind of funny to me, was like, he basically does this in the article, I guess, but it was kind of like there was a moment where he literally said something very close to like verbatim of, wokeness or like, critical race theory or what I'm deciding to call Marxism. Like he literally just says, like, I'm conflating these things. Like, that's what I'm doing here. And the other thing that I thought was kind of funny is like he talked about the reaction to the article as being overwhelmingly positive. He's like, it's only been 2 days, but like I'm getting nothing but really positive feedback from people. People are telling me that this is like a good synthesis of what they've been thinking for a long time.
So you got good feels.
He got good feels from it. But I mean, I didn't exactly get anything. I mean, it sounds like he kind of believes this, and I think he does have, there's underlying it a very deep concern with like being a conservative and holding on to traditional values. Like to some extent, I felt like the article was sort of gesturing, I know he says he's okay with liberalism because liberalism at least affirms the legitimacy of conservatism as being a point of view that you can vote for. But still, like, I kind of think his whole critique is built to be like, look, like liberalism leads to Marxism, so you should be a conservative. You should be believe in traditional values.
Well, he did write a book with nationalism in the title, defending it, right? Am I wrong about that?
Which I should say, there are some elements to that book that actually are surprisingly insightful. And this is the one thing that I want to actually...
I'm so tired of Matt's charitable readings.
No.
Can you just get on board with the dunk, please?
No. Well, this is what I'm getting to.
Yeah, it's a real diamond in the fucking rough, isn't it?
I'm kidding, Matt. I'm kidding. We all appreciate your charitable readings.
But this is the thing, though. If you actually read the central section of the essay, he gives Marxism a lot of credit, but in a strange way, because Hazoni tends to approach the world in terms of political antagonisms, right? Where he says, the real world, there's oppressor and oppressed groups. He really seems to believe this, right? And there will always be a dominant group and always be a subordinate group. And liberals have not recognized that, but Marxists have. And so he takes this almost Demestrian perspective of acknowledging the realism of his real political opponents, which is the political left relative to liberals, saying they understand that this is a war and only one side is going to win, and we need to do everything that we possibly can to be the victorious side, right? And this is kind of a weird attitude that some conservative authors sometimes take when they're dealing with the political left. Like Joseph de Maistre adopted the same perspective when it came to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? That Jean-Jacques Rousseau was an evil man. He was destroying civilization, but he was also far smarter than most of the liberal centrist commentators who thought that you could take the kind of revolutionary ideas that he was developing and moderate them. because life is ultimately an existential struggle for power. And the leftists understand that, the liberals don't. And we on the political right also need to understand that.
Yeah, you
right?
you get this in people like Roy Cohen and Roger Stone. I think that's their names, right? Like Trump's lawyer and Roger Stone. Like they're saying this is a zero-sum game and everything's a game. This is just game theory. We have to turn the rubes against our political opponents.
Yeah, and that's the way he treats liberals, right? It's like we need to turn the liberals against the left, get them to align with conservatism, even though we conservatives don't really want to be liberals, and ultimately liberalism is also going to have to go in the long run.
But
right?
it's worked. It's shifted the entire country to the right over the course of 30 years.
But that's the strange thing about what he wants out of this is that, well, Marxism is delegitimizing its opposition. But and he says liberalism is a gateway to Marxism. But what does he want then? He wants conservatism to win and have a kind of neutered liberal opposition that can just be like the legitimizer of their rule. But in the end, the conservative traditionalism is going to be the position that wins out. And he's just turning it around.
He's not shy about this. Actually, in another article, he overtly calls for an end to what he calls liberal democracy and the advent of what he calls conservative democracy, right? That ultimately there should be a highly traditionalist state that embeds a certain ethno-religious standpoint in its laws and in its foundations. But liberals be allowed basically some room to try to agitate and reform.
So basically,
not very much, but some.
The modern state of Israel, it sounds like he's describing.
Well,
Careful, guys. Careful.
Which is where he's from, which is why I'm saying that's clearly how he's approaching the world. Yeah.
I don't. By the way, I don't think that there's anything wrong with, and I think Michael Brooks, the late Michael Brooks, was smart in saying that, there's nothing wrong with criticizing Israel as a nation state. By the way, that is not intrinsically anti-Semitic.
Whether or not it's legitimate, we do not need the ADL to become fans of the Pill Pod.
No, that's the thing. You can't say anything about Israel because it's anti-Semitism. But he is a nationalist. He is a religious conservative. And he does have a thing for political strongmen like Orban and like Russia and like Putin, He has a thing for them. And he's really angry that the international community imposes laws and universal rights and all these things on Israel and criticizes their relationship with Palestine. So he writes a book to express how angry he is and how liberalism is all Marxist and fucked.
To be fair, Eric, have you seen Putin without his shirt? I mean, he's pretty fucking sexy, okay? I don't think you acknowledge the sex appeal of a strong man with a fucking six-pack,
Conservatives love strongmen like that. Exactly. They're just too sexy for the feels that conservative need.
Too sexy for sure.
Affect.
Exactly, the affect. But no, this is exactly what Eric is saying. I mean, I think is exactly right, that there's a kind of that's kind of the point I was trying to make before, that there's this weird move to delegitimize liberalism also, because for him, part of the key to the argument as I see it in this article is he's like, liberalism is dangerous in a way because it always opens the door to Marxism, right? Because as soon as you affirm equal rights, you're opening the door to this dangerous path. And of course, there's nothing dangerous about traditional values and conservatism, apparently.
Well, I just want to say,
it's
in
almost
case
like a
the
gamble.
ADL is listening or their algorithms are crawling our sound bites, the opinions of our contributors do not represent the opinions of the Pill Pod or Plastic Pills.
I didn't even say anything.
Yeah.
I didn't even say anything disparaging. I literally just said that it should be okay. Yeah,
it's enough.
Yeah.
In the Middle East, they don't even refer to it as Israel. They just call it Disneyland, just to avoid these kinds of delicate issues. So did you hear the news out of Disneyland last week? Oh, yeah, no, it looks bad in there. Well, see ya. We should just adopt that strategy to not anger your sponsors, Pills.
Yeah. I've been trying to deliberately avoid that, given that the last time I got into a debate about Israel, the thread was 2 years ago, and it's still going on. It resurrects itself.
Oh, I think I know that thread, yeah.
Is the Pill Pod the Pill Pod going to become the only anti-Disneyland podcast on the internet?
Oh, we've been anti-Disneyland since day 2 when we talked about Baudrillard. So we're opposed to Disneyland, the Disneylandification, right?
Right.
The World Disneyland.
Yeah.
Oh shit, I'm getting into Black Books territory. I should shut up.
Yeah, careful.
Hey, this is a real quote from Baudrillard. I am quoting Simulation and Simulacra.
Yeah. No, well, I think the one thing that I wanted to iterate, and this is one of the things that I bring up in my article, and it actually, I guess, relates back to the argument that we had last week about Hegel, is oddly enough, I think Hazoni is actually right about the connection between liberalism and Marxism, even though he doesn't necessarily want to be overt about it because that might alienate liberals and get them to realize that they have more in common with the political left than they do with the political right. Because I think that both liberalism and Marxism are distinctively modernist doctrines that are committed to the idea that every person is a moral equal and that they're all entitled to freedom. And really the only substantive normative difference between liberalism and Marxism, they're huge descriptive and historical differences, is that Marxists believe that the liberal state is insufficient for actually recognizing the moral equality of all individuals and ensuring that everyone is free, whereas most liberals believe that the state as we have it right now is sufficient, with even if it needs a few cosmetic reforms here or there, right? Whereas conservatism...
I disagree with that.
Okay, well, why'd you say that?
I mean,
okay,
if we're talking about an actual Marxist state, which is only temporary, by the way, but no, the difference between Marxism and liberalism, perhaps the difference, is property rights and the right to own property, and that the state can use violence to protect that right.
Okay.
So,
no, I think that's right, but I think, again...
He gets it from Rousseau, of course, but if you...
And belief in the free market, too. That's another big one, right? The 1970s, 80s neoliberal revolution, right? Where Hayek and Friedman's ideas became the backbone of Thatcherism and Reaganism, right? And it's all about the free market. The government, the market is so complex that it's useless for the government to try to regulate it. So rather, we should just have faith that it's going to work and that it's going to distribute rewards and punishments where they deserve to go.
Let's not conflate neoliberalism with liberalism, though.
Yeah,
of course. No, that's a neoliberal conservatism.
And this is actually one of the things that I want to say, though.
Liberalism, like old liberalism, like Rousseau comes in and says, there is no reason for you to buy into liberalism because you're going to be exploited no matter what. And he said this before Marx. Marx obviously picked up on it, but it's saying if you don't have property, there's no incentive for you to buy into the liberal system because the only purpose of it, underneath everything, underneath all the language of, voting rights, speech rights, is just protecting the ownership of property by one class that exploits another to, work their land and work their factories for them. So that's the difference to me.
Isn't that the subtext? Isn't that the subtext here? Isn't that the subtext here? Like social liberals are a bunch of ballless freaks, and you should either just go into the Marxist side or you should join the neoliberal free market side. Like he doesn't want you to be able to be like, I'm a social liberal. I believe in like certain aspects of the free market and trade and globalization, but I also believe that the government should step in and regulate things every once in a while. Like the subtext here is almost like that's a position for pussies. So either just man up and become a traditionalist conservative and believe in the completely fucking free market, or go out and join the protesters and burn down some buildings and go to prison. Like, isn't that the subtext
but I think
here, what this guy wants to say?
Yeah, I think that is actually in some sense what he's trying to say, right? But I think the association between liberalism and, let's just call it Marxism or the left, is more complicated than that, right? Because essentially what you have in some circumstances are liberals who ultimately don't believe that human beings are moral equals. And you see this expressed in people like Ayn Rand, sometimes F.A. Hayek, and so on and so forth, where they say people are unequal in their abilities, and this is reflected in the capitalist system. And when push comes to shove, they're more willing to side with the political right because ultimately they don't hold on to the fundamental liberal principle that people are moral equals. They just kind of adopt liberal rhetoric about capitalism and freedom and property rights because it's expedient in the given moment, right? But what I think a sincere liberalism recognizes is basically the Kantian doctrine, which is that everyone is entitled to an equal amount of dignity and a certain level of freedom. And if you genuinely believe that, I think that Hazoni, ironically, is actually right, that people are always going to be attracted to Marxism, because what Marxism says is that if you really believe that people are equal and deserve freedom, we don't live in a society where people are treated equally or have equal freedom, which means you need to reform it very substantially, right? And he talks about this article where he says, there's this dance between liberalism and Marxism that goes on. And I think the reason that this dance has gone on for such a long time is precisely because a lot of liberals recognize that our society is highly deficient, and they're tempted by the kind of radical reforms offered by people like Bernie Sanders or offered by people like AOC. And it's the job of people like Hazoni and other right-wing pundits to convince them that they shouldn't buy into that.
Wait, sorry. Are you accepting the premise that... I mean, he's calling liberals pussies because they cave to the communists all the time. But there are no fucking communists.
Yeah.
The reason that the fucking Democrat, whatever, right lib, they're fine with all these protests is because it doesn't touch any economic conditions. They're chilling. They're sipping champagne over Occupy Wall Street while people are protesting about rights issues and how there's not enough representation in Hollywood or whatever. So yeah, sure, you should protest. That should be something that changes for sure. Well, no, but as long I think as economic changes accompanies that. And that's the position of every, even moderate leftist.
And corporate America, they've fully integrated these, social justice ideas into their products, like Nike, right?
Yeah.
Putting Colin Kaepernick in that.
You're getting trained on how to be, more sensitive.
Yeah.
No, I think that's definitely true of certain kinds of woke capitalism, right? Which is where the Marxist critique becomes really relevant. What I'm just saying is that if you are a person who genuinely adopts a liberal outlook on things, there's always going to be this temptation to either move to the political right and say that people are not equal and people do not deserve freedom because all their views are not equally valid. Or you have to move towards the political left by saying, yes, people are equal. And if they are equal, then the kind of unequal society that we live in because of the critique of political economy that we can raise, that's a serious problem and we need to reform it, right? And I think what Hazoni is trying to do is make sure that people who operate in the political center gravitate towards the political right rather than the political left, because he's smart enough to recognize that there are premises in liberalism that can tempt many liberals to move towards Sanders and AOC and all that, particularly millennials, when that's not what he wants to happen, right?
And I should just shout out to our listeners, if you are looking for a position on the political spectrum, Matt is a radical leftist lib.
Liberal socialist.
You can be proud. You can be proud of being a lib, and you can be on the left.
But he's still a liberal cuck, according to Marxists.
Well, yeah, that's true. But I've long since accepted that.
I just calling him a cuck. Period. I'm not a Marxist. I'm a YouTuber.
Hey man, I have the same. I'm very close to Matt. Matt and I have very close political positions.
Yeah. I also think that Marx was aware of this, right? I mean, one of the things that he says with Engels in the Communist Manifesto is that with the advent of capitalism, for the first time, human beings are forced to confront the real relations that have existed since time immemorial, but have always been occluded by ideology and traditionalism, right? And throughout his writings, he often talks about how it is that liberal society in some senses is quite an accomplishment because it does at least formally treat people as free and equal under the law. The problem is that they aren't actually equal in any real material sense, which is why the next stage in human history is going to be the advent of a common society where we finally realize true freedom as self-determination in this Hegelian sense through the advent of a classist society, right? But this isn't a break from liberalism in the sense that liberalism was bad and needs to be rejected, so much as it's the next stage in a historical process of which liberalism was the highest form to exist thus far. You know what I mean? And this is why I think people like Hazoni really react badly to this, because they recognize that under the right conditions, a lot of liberals can sit there and say things like, hey, yes, if we do believe that people are free and equal, maybe we shouldn't discriminate against people on the basis of their race. Maybe we should allow people to practice their religion as they see fit. Maybe we should sit there and try to create something like universal healthcare systems and so on and so forth.
I do think it is interesting that he argues against, he lumps Enlightenment liberalism into his critique. I find that pretty interesting. And he's kind of against this individualism. He almost accepts the idea of group identity, but it should be defined by traditional values rather than by reason and abstract principles. I actually like that aspect of what he's doing, because individualism is a crock of shit, and I think it's ridiculous that people like Peterson can still stand up there and say we're individuals first and groups second. It's like, no, the only reason you're an individual is because we are fundamentally social beings. Goes back to Aristotle. We're political animals, the Marxist Aristotle we all know. But I think that's a step in the right direction, to get away from this sort of atomism that liberalism wants to foist on us, and we're all just individual rational actors in a marketplace. But then he sort of goes in the wrong direction with the religious nationalism. And I'm like, okay, no, let's take away individualism, but we don't need to put religious nationalism and traditionalism in there. We can put something else in there. And I guess I don't have it ready what that could be. And that's the critique of Marxism, too. Once this is all gone, what is Marx's solution? What does the communist society actually look like? Which is, I guess that's a legitimate critique of Marxism, although, like, I don't know how much Marx actually predicts that.
I've often wondered this, Eric, like, if you were to create a philosophical system that gains enough traction, would you want to call it, like, Tateism? Or, like, what would your own politics be called? Because Tateism is just, like, a weird term. Like... Yeah, Ericism is also difficult.
McManusism.
Welcome.
McManusianism is something I'm saying. Yeah, I don't think that works either. But this is the problem. Like, McManusian, there you go. Yeah. Brezonianism isn't bad.
Brezonianism sounds pretty good, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, Brezonianism actually
I have a very boring Anglophone name.
I'm easy because you just become a philosopher. Which is not as arrogant as declaring yourself a philosopher. It's a step down.
I have a very boring English name that I wouldn't care to name a theory after.
A Tatian.
Tatian works.
There's a lot of words that have my name in it. I could play with that.
All right, but I think we're about
done
here.
But it's too British.
It's coming to a natural close. But I just want to shout out to our guest, Victor Litvik, USSR Litvik. Baby, to give us the final thoughts here. I think we went through a very cathartic like bell curve up in here.
I feel it was necessary, yeah.
We got our rage out, and now I just feel like you guys should come down here. We'll have some martinis.
Yeah.
That'd be nice.
I'm gonna have a beer. As the Romanian poet such and such said.
No, it's just, again,
that's our close.
I take comfort in the fact that this is clearly kind of like one of those reactionary sort of like cries out against the movement of history, basically. Like, it just seems like back in the 60s, if somebody had been writing about like Martin Luther King and trying to like associate him with the Red Scare or something, it's so clearly going to like date itself within just a few years that if this is how he's criticizing like summer 2020 and BLM and everything through like sloppy connections with Marxism, like these guys have already basically lost. Like, if this is the best that they can do, basically. Yeah.
That's a good point. Can I also close out? I was just reading at the comments section in the article, and I think this is a good one. Neil Bowling says, "Wow, simply the most amazing article I've read anywhere in years. I'm forwarding this to everyone I know, liberal or conservative. There is so much here to digest. Thank God for Colette. At one time, this is the sort of high caliber writing one could find in the Atlantic or the New Yorker. But of course, those days are long gone."
Dude, you know this has to be a shill. There's no possible way. But by the way, I have my own. From the same article. A remarkable piece with so much to consider. It really frames and explains what we've seen happening over the past 50 years with the weakening and destruction of our institutional and societal foundations. Most simply, the best article I've ever read.
Destroy. That's a favorite word.
Anyways, okay, it would be improper to not leave the last word with Eric, who's going to remind us why all of this doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Oh my God. You want me to see us off?
Go off.
If you want to.
You know what, listeners, if you're on our side, and you probably are if you're listening to this, unless you're a curious conservative, then fuck you.
And if you're 20,
if you're on our side,
and you're 20, then fuck you too.
Yeah.
Just kidding, by the way. But if you do encounter this kind of viewpoint, think of an analogy like if you meet a creationist, you don't feel like you have to become an expert in biology in evolutionary biology and the history of life in order to argue against them. Just go with your gut. You're right. What he's talking about is not Marxism. It's not, quote, Marxists know very well that their aim is to destroy the intellectual and cultural traditions that are holding liberalism in place. Don't let this fucking quack from Israel tell you what Marxism is. He doesn't fucking know. He doesn't know.
Disneyland.
Goofy from Disneyland. We love Goofy, don't we, folks? We love Goofy.
Apologies to Mickey Mouse and all of his subsidiaries.
Don't listen to what this fucking guy has to say about Marxism. That's all.
And you know what? In 200 years, we're all going to be underwater anyway.
Yeah, we're all going to be jingoists. Nationalists.
Nationalists for Atlantis.
What's the future like? They're going to be planetarians in the future when we're all inhabiting different worlds. And I'm like, my world is better than your fucking world, man. I'm a planetarian.
You're optimistic if you think we're going to get that far.
Yeah, it's true. I don't think we're going to make it that far.
Yeah, we got to get off this rock.
From the members of the Pill Pod, thanks so much for coming. And if you guys want to, we're just going to keep talking after we finish recording. But you can cancel your recordings now after you say bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Yeah, man. Bye.
Peace.
It's been, I don't want to say it's been a pleasure, but it's been something.
It's been a time.